In this number 3 in my series of webcasts, I'm going to talk about what makes you unique and my insights into why serial killers are different from regular psychopaths. Most people recognize that we might be perhaps a little neurotic, someone else is a bit narcissistic, someone else might be a bit autistic and doesn't really seem to get jokes or get to understand why their jokes aren't funny. We like to think that we all lump within this great normality of human existence and human behavior. But it's not really the truth, because each of us is quite unique. I'm going to use some simple visualizations to try to bring you over to my way of thinking, to seeing why people with disorders shouldn't be viewed as being that different from any of us. Welcome to the Madman Rants. I'm your host, Kevin Leonard. Why should you listen to me? I've spent my entire life puzzling over why people will do the sometimes bizarre and counterproductive things that they do, and I've come up with a lot of answers. I'm pretty good at seeing connections between things that weren't connected before and seeing the threads that draw them together. You might agree with my opinions, my insights into human behavior, or you may not. But maybe that's the point, to get a different perspective on things. Why is my perspective perhaps a little different than other people's? Well, I've lived and worked in the Middle East and Africa, in Europe, in Mexico, Canada, and the US. I've traveled around the world several times, and after I graduated from university, I spent 2 years hitchhiking around the globe. I blog extensively about my insights into human nature and into the future of marketing. I spent most of my career working in international ad agencies. Most recently, I've been a marketing strategy consultant, and I've done a lot of public speaking. I started off my quest into human nature in university, where I studied motivational psychology and the evolution of human behavior. What I believe is that curiosity builds brains. People with high IQs tend to be very curious, and people who are incurious, well, I'll let you figure that one out for yourself. I had my own ad agency in Mexico for many years, and there was a specific type of individual that I was looking for. And these are some of the attributes of those individuals. So for someone who's perhaps lazy versus being a wired-up workaholic, I was looking for people who were more on this side of that scale. In terms of being analytical, I was not looking for people who were allergic to numbers, but rather for people who were really mathematicians and analysts and not scared of doing that sort of work, versus people who absolutely hated selling and putting themselves out there to sell services. I was looking for people who found closing a sale to be a real thrill. Versus people who were intellectually challenged, I was looking more for people who were geniuses. And versus people who could not grasp concepts, I was looking for people who could visualize concepts in their heads. So when I take all of these characteristics and lump them together, the kind of people that I was looking for, and I wanted as team members in my team, they all lumped over on one end. If we look at this instead of being an intersection, but rather try to imagine this more as a shape, let me go to what you're all familiar with, I'm sure, the bell curve. In this example from many years ago here in Canada, an employee of Tim Hortons, which is a Canadian coffee and donut shop, was fired because she gave a crying baby a Timbit, which is a little tiny piece of donut, because the employer felt that he could no longer trust the employee, that if she was willing to give away a Timbit, she'd probably be willing to walk out the back door with dozens of donuts every week. So on a scale between the type of employee who brings his or her family a dozen donuts a day that they smuggle out of their place of work versus the type of person who wouldn't give a Timbit to an armed robber, on this scale, there's the vast majority of people who may feel deep in their hearts as though their employer makes more than enough profit off of them and their hard work and clever thinking to consider taking a free donut once in a while. There are people on this side of the bell curve who wouldn't steal anything from their employer. And on the very end of the scale, at a very small percentage, there are people who wouldn't give a Timbit to an armed robber. They are incorruptible, the real angels of our better nature. The employer is thinking, I want people who are lumped over on this end of the behavioral scale. In terms of looking at employees who are antisocial versus being true people persons, the employer, especially at a place like Tim Hortons, wants people who are over on this side of that scale. And versus people who don't notice that their shoelaces are untied, versus being meticulous about their appearance and their environment, the employer wants people who are over on this side of the scale. When we lump all of these together, we end up with this sort of an egg shape, tapering off that way, but lumped over on this side. But the reality is that egg shape that the employer wants is very rarely matched by all of their employees because of the eccentricities of human nature. Each of us is unique. Each of us is different. So just one attribute that a person has, even if they're really good on all the rest, tends to break that egg shape. Going back to the issue of whether or not they feel no compunction at all about stealing donuts, there might be one person or a few people who feel that way, and that causes employee theft. Which brings me to something I call the new normal. What amazes me is that no matter where you put human beings, no matter what circumstances you put them in, no matter what things change around them, they very quickly start saying, well, it's normal. It's everything that we do is fine because it's now normal. This includes things like putting smartphones and tablets into little kids' hands. These things are highly addictive, they're designed to be addictive, and we are addicting children at an age where they're highly impressionable and their brains are pruning and changing as they're growing. By putting these devices into their hands so early and then leaving them in their hands through their teen years and into their 20s, we are fundamentally changing the wiring of the human brain, and we have no idea what that's going to do. And yet parents will say it's all good because the kid down the street has one, the kid next door has one, it's all normal. It is what I call the new normal, and it's a dangerous thing. The reason I have this illustration of a sphere up here is that when we think about all of those scales of behavior, and those scales are virtually infinite, there is a difference between being jealous and not being jealous, and being envious and not being envious. They're very close to being the same, but they're actually somewhat different. So we think of normality as this sort of a sphere where there's an infinite number of scales that are going through and ending on the surface of this sphere. And we all think of ourselves as more or less normal like that. Oh, we're all perfectly spherical and normal. And yet we know we're not. As I said in the beginning, some of us are neurotic, some of us aren't. Some of us are psychotic, and some of us aren't. So the sphere of normality is all these extremes, from being envious to not being envious, from being talkative to not being talkative, from being hyperactive to not, from being criminal to being an angel, a saint. And yet, as much as our ego wants to tell us that we are great and spherical and we're very normal and we're not more one way or the other, the reality is that we're actually probably lumped more on one end than the other, kind of like this egg shape that our employers would like to see of us. But then, when you think about it, probably we're not even egg-shaped, because each one of us is quite odd in our collection of values and things that we are extreme on or are not on. We are not dead center on the bell curve on each one of those scales. In fact, if you think about each of us, we are probably kind of lumpy. You know, our behavior on any given set of those scales is probably more like this. It's kind of lumpy. We have extremes of behavior in one area that are more one way and other extremes that are more in another way. You might look like that kind of lumpy shape. I might be like this one. Some other people would be more extreme on this end than that end, etc., etc. So we are not spherical. We are unique in our collection of sometimes extremes on those scales, sometimes averages. And sure, there are probably some people who are quite average on most things, and yet they're still never going to be 100% spherical in their nature. So let's take a look at that bell curve of behavior. Here's IQ. You're all familiar with this. So at 14%, there's very few people who are between 115 and 130 on the IQ scale. In fact, once we get up to 140 plus on the scale, which is considered genius, you are at what they call the 99.5th percentile. And that means that only 1 in 200 people on average is that smart. In fact, when we go up past that, you get into even smaller percentages. So people who are very, very smart or people who are very, very psychotic are very rare. And when we look at an average bell curve, just the standard model of it, we can use that bell curve to talk about just about any kind of extremes of behavior. So if we look at psychopathy, and I call this the psychopathy spectrum, most of us are somewhere on that spectrum. No, we're not psychopaths, but all of us are within the spectrum. Sure, there are some people at the far end that have zero psychopathic traits, but if you go online and do the HARE, H-A-R-E, psychopathy test, you'll find that there are questions there that you go, yeah, geez, you know, that's kind of like me, or at least on one or two of the things you would go, well, yeah, sometimes I'm like that. But the vast majority of us are nowhere near diagnosable on the overall bell curve of psychopathy. We know that 1 to 2%, and here's where the 2% cutoff is, of the human beings on the planet are psychopaths. Only a small percentage of those psychopaths, though, become serial killers. Perhaps they are 0.1%, perhaps even rarer. Maybe they're 1 in 1,000 psychopaths. And that got me thinking, why is it that only this small percentage of psychopaths become serial killers? What is it about them that makes them that unique within that disorder? And things fell into place for me because I tend to be a visual thinker. When I looked at this other distribution that happens in nature, discovered by an Italian, I think he was a geographer in the late 1800s. In this distribution chart, things tend to congregate down in the bottom left, where they are of low consequence and rarely unlikely to happen. In looking at this distribution, what occurred to me was that if you invert the distribution to say, okay, on the likelihood scale, these individuals are almost certainly psychopaths, and the consequence of what that means is extreme. And then you think of this as intersectionality, as dots of intersection versus simply dots on a graph. And we look at this small amount, this tiny percentage of psychopaths who end up being serial killers. I began to think about, well, okay, if everyone is on every scale, and some people happen to be extreme on any given scale, or a collection of those axes, of those scales, of those bell curves, then what perhaps we're looking at with regard to a Paretto distribution within this is, if we only look at that small slice of the bell curve that harbors the diagnosable psychopaths, let's say, then it is almost as though that concentration we are seeing at the very small end, right, the very few dots that get concentrated only at this very extreme end, it's almost as though on all the behavioral scales that lead someone to be a serial killer, not just a psychopath, there's only a few individuals at that end that have all of those extremes and are crazy enough to actually be serial killers, acting upon their compulsion to do very strange things, torture and maim, etc. So on that serial killer cross-section of the bell curve, I believe we're seeing this very rare combination of behavioral characteristics of extremes on all of these different bell curves of extreme behavior that leads certain individuals to become serial killers and act upon their whims. So what occurred to me was that this could really be true of all disorders. That when you look at schizophrenia, when you look at depression, etc., that if you look at the bell curve of people in the world and the ones who end up on that very extreme end, perhaps in the ones that are most dysfunctional, we're seeing an intersectionality of extreme behaviors. This kind of changed my view of the way I look at people with disorders and the way we label people with disorders, because they aren't just their disorder. Within that disorder and within that diagnosis, individuals are very different in the way that they function and the way that they act and the way that they feel and the way they behave. And the more we think about it this way versus the way that we always have, which is that, oh, well, they got diagnosed by a psychiatrist because they had 9 out of the 11 characteristics that had been developed on a particular questionnaire. Most of us, unfortunately, then go, oh, well, so they've got that disorder. I know what they're going to be like. I know how to treat them because I know how they're going to behave. And that's actually not true. People are vastly unique within any given disorder. In terms of diversity and in terms of how we interpret people and how we accept people into the workplace. In one company that I worked for, we had a guy named Robert who was autistic. And he was quite functional and he was quite funny. And a lot of people treated him really badly because they said, oh, well, he's autistic. He's not worth the time to talk to and befriend. But I befriended him and we used him in a contest because Robert knew everything there was to know about baseball, going back to the beginning of the league in North America, and could answer any question. He also knew when every bus was going to arrive at every bus stop in the city of Toronto. You could give him an intersection, tell him what bus number you wanted to know about, and he would actually tell you when that bus was going to arrive. Quite an amazing guy. So Robert was functional because on the scales of a bunch of different attributes, he was in the middle, but on a few, he was extreme. Whereas other autistics maybe way over on the extreme on a bunch of different things, and they end up not being able to function in society. So if my webcast today made you go, aha, and think about things in a slightly different way than you have in the past, I hope you'll look at the rest of my webcasts. And if you're curious, you can read more of my insights into human nature by going to justonecynicsopinion.blogspot.com. If the insights I offered up today on a new way of looking at people made you think in a new way than you did before, I hope you'll consider buying me a beer by going to one of my blogs and clicking in the top right corner to make a donation, or go to patreon.com, look me up there, and become a supporter. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll come back.